Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, about grace and gratitude and pulling closer when the year had beaten you up. But I'll never forget the way my daughter looked at me that night, standing in her kitchen, laughing at the dish I carried in my hands like it was a punchline. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because this story, it's not just about me. It's about every parent who's ever swallowed humiliation from the very child they once carried on their shoulders. It was late afternoon in Hartford, Connecticut. The cold had that sharp edge, the kind that makes the air smell like iron. I wore my old Carhartt jacket, the one with grease stains that never came out, and balanced a Pyrex dish wrapped in foil. Inside was green bean casserole. Nothing fancy, cans of soup, store-brand fried onions, 2 bags of Aldi green beans I'd thawed in the sink. The receipt was still tucked under the lid, $7.84. I didn't think twice about it. The moment I walked in, I knew I didn't belong in that version of Thanksgiving. The turkey smelled like butter and sage. The table shimmered with rented stemware and a centerpiece from Whole Foods that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. Emma, my daughter, 32 years old and dressed in some floral apron from Anthropology, turned to her husband and said, "Look at this." Dad brought Dollar Tree dinner. Her friends giggled, wine glasses clinking. I stood there, gripping the warm glass dish, and for a second I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I wasn't just embarrassed. I was gutted. Because this was the same girl I once drove across the country for softball tournaments, eating gas station sandwiches to save money so she could have new cleats. I set the Pyrex down carefully on the counter. Next to it, I dropped my keys, a black leather checkbook I still use, and a manila envelope I'd carried with me. Tyler, my son-in-law, smirked and muttered something about boomers and their checkbooks. I ignored him, but my eyes flicked to the envelope. I had brought it for a reason, though none of them knew yet. "Where do you keep your mortgage papers?" I asked Emma, trying to sound casual. She rolled her eyes like I'd asked for her high school diary. "Why? You moving in?" The laughter cut through me, but I said nothing. I just slid the Aldi receipt out from under the foil and pressed it onto the fridge with a magnet shaped like a turkey. That's when the first twist came. "Why would you put that there?" Emma asked, mocking. I shrugged. Receipts matter when the math gets real. Her friends didn't get it. They thought it was a weird old man thing, like saving ketchup packets. But I saw Tyler glance at the envelope, his face tightening for just a second. He knew. As I sat at the folding table they'd rented from Party City, the chatter around me felt like static. I remembered how many winters I'd come home with my hands stiff from fixing busted furnaces, how Anna, my late wife, used to make the same casserole for us because it was cheap. Yes, but also warm and filling. That Pyrex still has her mother's initials scratched into the bottom. They didn't notice, but I traced the letters with my finger. When Emma leaned over to whisper, loud enough for me to hear, "He's not bringing food, he's bringing baggage," I felt something shift inside me. Years of biting my tongue hardened into something else. I looked up at her and said quietly, "You have no idea what I brought." Her smile faltered. Tyler tried to change the subject, but the room had gone too still. I could feel every eye on me. My heart was pounding, not from shame anymore, but from resolve. Because what they didn't know was that casserole, that crumpled receipt, and that envelope sitting on the counter were about to change everything. And when I finally opened it, none of them would laugh again. I didn't sleep much that night after Thanksgiving. The laughter, the way Emma called my dish Dollar Tree dinner, it kept replaying in my head like a broken record. But what ate at me even more was the envelope I'd left sitting there, untouched, like a warning no one took seriously. The truth was, I already knew more about their life than they realized. I knew the numbers behind the shiny countertops, the Audi in the driveway, the catered parties. They weren't living. They were borrowing air. And I'd been the one pumping oxygen into their lungs without them even knowing. Back in September, a letter from Wells Fargo ended up at my shop by mistake. Old address trick. Emma had once used my business address to get a better rate on shipping. That letter wasn't a flyer, it was a collections notice. Past due on the mortgage, 90 days. Amount owed, $9,467.22. I sat in my garage with the paper in my hands. The same garage where I keep a fireproof safe, stuffed with Anna's trust documents, and a sticky note that reads, "No more rescues, without boundaries." But boundaries are harder to hold when it's your own child. I went to the bank, pulled out 3 cashier's checks, and covered the arrears. I didn't tell Emma, didn't tell Tyler. I just bought them time. That's what fathers do, right? Buy time with money, with sweat, with pieces of themselves. At first I told myself it was temporary. Then Shelley, the woman from the bank, mentioned something else. A second loan, a HELOC, maxed out. And the paperwork didn't match the renovations. I went home and dug deeper. Tyler had been writing checks to a contractor LLC. The problem? That LLC didn't exist in any meaningful way. A shell. I looked it up with the Secretary of the State's office. The address traced back to his cousin's duplex in New Britain. That's when the anger set in. Not just at Tyler, but at myself. I raised Emma to be better than this. Or did I? Did I spoil her so much that she thought love was measured in blank checks? Did I make her think she could laugh at me because I never once let her face real consequences? A week before Thanksgiving, I found another twist of the knife. I picked up my iPad, the one Emma synced years ago when she borrowed it for school. Her iCloud was still linked. One swipe and I was in her photo album. Among the baby pictures and yoga shots was a screenshot of a text to her friend. "Dad is cheap on purpose. He wants control." That sentence split me in two. Cheap? I worked my whole life so she wouldn't feel cheap. I patched roofs in sleet, crawled into basements full of asbestos, ate gas station hot dogs so she could wear a prom dress from Macy's. And control? If control means making sure she didn't drown in debt, then yeah, maybe I wanted control. But in that moment, all I felt was betrayal. So I screenshotted it. I saved it. And I whispered to myself, "Control? You want to see control?" That was the night I started my own paper trail. Not to hurt her, but to protect the grandson who still calls me Papa and climbs into my recliner with sticky hands. I met with a credit union manager in Newington, asked him about delinquent debt. I called an attorney off Asylum Avenue, paid a $1,500 retainer, and asked how HOA liens work. The attorney said, if they're delinquent, the HOA can sell the lien to anyone willing to pay the balance. Even a family member, by the time the turkey went in the oven on Thanksgiving Day, I had already stepped into their financial shadow. I had already bought one of their problems out from under them. Emma thought I brought casserole. Tyler thought I brought baggage. But what I really brought was leverage. And when the time was right, I planned to use it. The question, the one I wrestled with at 2 a.m. while staring at the ceiling, was simple. Was this justice? Or was I just another man hiding control behind the word love? Because once I opened that envelope, there'd be no going back. And the next words out of my mouth would decide whether my daughter saw me as her father or her enemy. By the time Black Friday rolled around, my daughter and her husband were posting pictures of themselves sipping pumpkin lattes in downtown West Hartford, pretending everything was perfect. But I knew better. I'd seen the letters, the overdrafts, the shell game they were playing with credit cards. And now, after Thanksgiving, with her words about me being cheap for control burned into my chest, I wasn't just her father anymore. I was holding evidence, and maybe even their future, in my hands. I didn't tell anyone where I was headed that morning. While everyone else lined up outside Best Buy chasing flat-screen deals, I drove to Newington to sit across from a credit union manager. I slid a folder across his desk, copies of their mortgage delinquency, the HELOC statement I'd pulled, and the HOA dues I suspected they hadn't paid in months. He tapped the numbers on his calculator and said, "They're bleeding out. Whoever holds these liens holds the steering wheel." His words stuck with me. the steering wheel. For years, I thought I was just a passenger in Emma's new life. Maybe I wasn't. Later that week, I parked my truck outside a small law office on Asylum Avenue. The attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s, told me the truth in plain English. If the HOA sells you their lien, you become the association. You can foreclose if dues aren't paid. I paid her retainer, $1,500 cash, folded from the drawer where I used to keep emergency money for broken furnaces. She looked at me hard before I left and said, "You sure you want to be the villain in your daughter's story?" That question dug at me. Was I protecting her, or was I about to humiliate her in front of her friends and family? But every time I thought of backing down, that screenshot came back. "Dad is cheap on purpose. He wants control," I kept hearing it, like she'd already painted me as a monster. Maybe the only thing left was to prove her right, but on my own terms. A week later, the HOA board, just 3 retirees who care more about lawn height than families, voted to sell me their lien for $2,940. Just like that, I wasn't just dad anymore. I was the legal owner of my daughter's overdue problem. I signed the papers with shaking hands. For a moment, I felt sick. Then I remembered the Audi in the driveway, the designer bags, the Cabo vacation on a maxed-out card. Sick turned into cold clarity, but the deeper twist came when I dug into Tyler's contractor payments. The LLC name on the checks, Harborview Electrical, looked real enough. I pulled it up on the Secretary of the State's site, registered to his cousin. No active license, no employees, nothing but a P.O. box in New Britain. Tyler had been siphoning money through fake invoices, tax fraud in plain daylight, and the kicker, he claimed those payments as deductions. If the IRS ever looked, they'd both drown. That night, sitting in my recliner with the same checkbook Emma mocked, I stared at the folder in my lap. Mortgage arrears, HOA lien, fake LLC. I had the makings of their collapse in my hands. All I had to do was pull the thread. But a voice in the back of my head kept asking, was I saving them from themselves, or was I about to nuke the bridge between me and my only child? I thought of my grandson, his sticky little hands reaching for me, the way he fell asleep on my chest while cartoons played in the background. Did I really want him growing up watching his parents dragged through court because of me? But then again, what lesson would he learn if no one ever held them accountable? So I made a decision. I'd confront them, but not in secret, not in whispers. The truth would come out in the same room where they laughed at me, with the same witnesses who clinked glasses when they mocked my casserole. That's why on Thanksgiving I placed that envelope right next to the Pyrex on the counter. Not because I wanted to ruin dinner, because I wanted Emma to know her father wasn't just some washed-up old man with cheap food and old tools. I wanted her to understand that every receipt, every scrap of paper I saved, every hour I worked with broken hands, those things had weight. And when I finally slid that envelope across the table, I didn't plan to raise my voice. I planned to let the numbers do the talking. The question, the one that kept me awake, wasn't whether I could take them down. It was whether, when I finally showed my daughter what I'd done, she'd see it as protection or betrayal. And when Tyler leaned back in his chair, smirking like he already knew I had nothing, I tapped the envelope with one finger and said, "Let's talk about who really owns this house." The room froze, and in that silence, I knew I was about to change everything. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the furnace clicking on in the basement. My daughter's friends froze mid-sip of their wine, forks suspended above plates of cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes. Emma stared at me like I had spoken another language. Tyler leaned back in his chair with that smug grin he always wore, as if nothing I said could possibly matter. I slid the envelope across the table until it touched his wrist. He didn't pick it up. He just laughed under his breath and said, "You can't do anything, old man. We own this place." That's when I tapped the envelope with one finger and said evenly, "Open it." Emma hesitated before tearing the flap. Out slid 3 cashier's checks, each stapled to a notice from Wells Fargo, dates highlighted in yellow. September, October, November. $3,155.74 each. Her eyes widened. You paid this? Her voice cracked, and for a second I almost softened. But then I remembered the text she sent, mocking me for being cheap for control, and the laughter that night when I set down the casserole. My jaw clenched. You're sitting here mocking me with your friends, I said, my voice low, while I was keeping this house from going into foreclosure. The color drained from her face. Tyler grabbed the papers, scanning them, then tossed them back onto the table. So what? You covered it. Thanks, I guess. That doesn't mean you own anything. That's when I pulled out the next document, a signed assignment of lien from the Brookside Meadows HOA. My name printed neatly at the bottom. You're wrong, I told him. I don't own this house. But I do own the lien you've ignored for 6 months. And in this state, that gives me the right to foreclose. The guests shifted uncomfortably. One of Emma's friends whispered, Wait, can he really do that? The tension was thick enough to choke on. Emma's hands trembled as she held the paper. Dad, why would you do this? Because, I said, looking her in the eye, you were drowning, and instead of asking for help, you mocked the only person who has ever pulled you out of the water. I've bailed you out quietly for years. Not anymore. Not without accountability, Tyler tried to laugh it off. This is ridiculous. You wouldn't embarrass your own daughter like this. Not in front of everyone. That's when I reached into the folder and pulled out the final piece. Printouts from the Secretary of the State's website. Harborview Electrical LLC, registered to his cousin. No license, no employees, nothing but a shell. You've been running fake invoices, I said coldly. You took out a HELOC for home improvements and funneled the money into a scam, and then you wrote it off as expenses. That's fraud, Tyler. Do you want me to read out loud the letter I already drafted to your employer's compliance office? The grin vanished from his face. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked afraid. Emma's eyes darted between us. Dad, please. But I didn't let her finish. You wanted to know what I brought to Thanksgiving? I brought the truth, and I brought a choice. I stood then, letting my words hang heavy. Either you both come clean, pay what you owe, and start acting like parents worthy of that little boy sleeping upstairs, or I pull the trigger. And believe me, once I do, you won't just lose this house. You'll lose your reputations, your jobs, and your friends sitting here. We'll see exactly who you are. The silence broke into whispers. One of Emma's friends muttered, Honestly, he's right. That's fraud. Another said, But he's her dad. Should a father really do this? I could feel the judgment in the room, split right down the middle. Half of them saw me as cruel, the other half as justified, and that was exactly where I wanted it, because nothing stings more than public truth. Emma pressed her palms to her eyes, shoulders shaking. The Pyrex dish sat between us, casserole untouched, steam now gone cold. She whispered, Mom would hate this. I leaned closer, my voice soft but sharp as glass. Your mother believed in honesty. She believed in work, and she would never have mocked family who put food on the table. Tyler slammed his fist against the chair. You can't control us. I gathered the papers back into the envelope, slid it under my arm, and said, I don't have to control you. I just have to decide whether to mail this in the morning. Every eye followed me as I walked to the door, the crunch of my boots on the hardwood echoing like a gavel. I paused with my hand on the knob, turned back just enough to see their pale faces. Think about it, I said. You've got until Monday. And with that, I left the casserole behind, the smell of sage and butter still heavy in the air, while the weight of their future pressed down on every soul in that dining room. I gave them until Monday. I figured they'd ignore me, call my bluff, maybe try to guilt me into backing down. But Sunday night, my phone buzzed with a message from Emma. Just a single photo, her dining table, bare except for the Pyrex casserole dish. Underneath it was a crumpled envelope addressed to me. I almost didn't open it when she dropped it in my mailbox. Inside was a check, not from her, but from Tyler. Post-dated, scribbled handwriting, the kind that told me he'd emptied whatever scraps were left in his account. A note was paper-clipped to it. "We'll make it right. Don't ruin us." But the real twist came the next morning. I'd already sent copies of the LLC paperwork and the contractor invoices to his new employer's compliance office. I didn't expect much. I thought maybe it would scare him straight. Instead, I got a call from an HR manager. Tyler wasn't just in trouble. The company had been investigating irregularities in his onboarding. My documents weren't the first red flags. By Tuesday afternoon, he was escorted out of the building, and then came the fallout. Without Tyler's salary, without my quiet bailouts, their world shrank fast. The Audi lease was canceled. Emma texted me a photo of a Subaru Forester with 98,000 miles. No caption. Her designer handbags started popping up on Facebook Marketplace. The friends who once sat at that Thanksgiving table stopped coming around. It turns out people like pretty parties, not messy truth. The HOA lien paid off in full that same week. Wire transfer, confirmation posted on the association's bulletin board for everyone in the neighborhood to see. For once, it wasn't me covering the bill. It was them, scrambling, facing the math they'd avoided for years. But the hardest moment, the one I didn't expect, came late one night when Emma showed up at my door. She wasn't dressed up, no makeup, just sweatpants and swollen eyes. She carried the Pyrex dish in both hands, the initials scratched into the glass, catching the porch light. She set it on my counter and whispered, "I never realized how heavy this was. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't hug her. Not right away." I let the silence sit between us. Because forgiveness, I learned, doesn't have to be fast to be real. The justice felt sharp, almost cold at first. Tyler's reputation tanked. Their finances collapsed. Their friends vanished. But for me, the closure wasn't about watching them fall. It was about knowing they finally had to stand without leaning on my back. That was the only way they'd ever learn. Looking back, I don't feel triumphant. I feel relieved, like I finally set down a weight I'd carried too long. Parents think love means shielding their kids forever, but sometimes love is handing them the bill and letting them read the numbers for themselves. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The truth has a way of catching up. You can hide it behind quartz countertops and fancy cars, but eventually the math shows up at your door. And when it does, you either pay it or someone else will make you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between protecting someone you love and forcing them to face the consequences? I'd really like to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Your stories matter more than you think. And if this story resonated with you, stick around for the next one. I've got plenty more to tell.